Welcome to this web lecture on the magnitude and effect of transport emissions. If we want to understand what the magnitude and the effect is of transport on the society, we first have to understand the concept of a negative externality. A negative externality is a negative impact that a given activity is having on the rest of the world or the rest of society. So if we're talking about transport negative externalities, then we can look into congestion for one. So none of us likes to stand in a traffic jam, and it's obvious that the more cars there are, the more trucks there are, the more we are actually transporting, the more mobility we're having, the more severe this congestion gets. So that is why this is a negative externality. Then we're having noise pollution. So if you ever stood next to a major highway, you know how severely traffic is affecting the sound quality, how easily you can hear other people. Then we're having infrastructure damage. So each car, each truck produces some wear and tear on the streets. And obviously we would all prefer it if there was no one else driving on our streets, because then the streets would not deteriorate so fast. Then we're having one of the most obvious ones, which is the greenhouse gases. And if we're talking greenhouse gases, we're not only talking CO2, even though CO2 in particular related to transport is one of the most significant ones. We're also talking, for example, NOx emissions. Then we're having accidents. So of course, every person who additionally travels incurs a certain risk for other parties to be affected by a traffic accident. And of course, this does not only affect people that are using motorized traffic, but also non-motorized traffic. And lastly, we have air and water pollution. So if we're looking into air and water pollution, we have, for example, fine particles, which are flying around and which are actually one of the most severe emissions if we're looking specifically into cities, where the greenhouse gases are sort of leaving the city again, but of course the particles are actually staying where they are. Just to give you a few numbers, so what we're seeing is more than 200,000 premature deaths associated with air pollution, which does not exclusively come from traffic and transport, but of course a considerable part of it comes from there. On the other hand, in Brussels alone, we're seeing more than 60,000 euros per day in healthcare-related costs due to air pollution, which is a tremendous amount just for one city. And part of the reason why these costs are so high is the fact that transport emissions and emissions in general are still increasing. So transport emissions, as you can see in this figure here, have actually been increasing in the last decade. And that is problematic because in general, we're of course trying to reduce emissions, but particularly transport continues to increase. And the reason why increasing transport emissions is a big issue is transport contributes 20% today of the global emissions. So any increase here is of course also really going to increase our bottom line when it comes to total emissions. And one of the reasons why we continue to increase with emissions is that we still have increasing transport. So we see 20% more passenger travel over a 20-year period, but this is 20% in total. At the same time, we're seeing an over 80% increase in air travel. And simultaneously also a 22% increase in freight transport. So the entire transport, both people and freight, has been increasing by about 20%. That, of course, introduces additional emissions unless we find a way to reduce emissions from transport by itself. What I would like you to take away from this series of web lectures is, first of all, what a negative externality is. Secondly, what magnitude we're looking at if we're looking into emissions. And lastly, the effect of those emissions. Thanks.